Hello, and thank you for joining us for Prep, Plan, Protect, an E911 compliance roadmap. This program is part of the SHRM webcast series. You can learn about upcoming and on-demand events from our e-newsletters and the webcast homepage at shrm.org/webcast. SHRM thanks Everbridge for sponsoring this program and our series of free webcasts for the HR community. Now about today's program. All U.S. organizations using multi-line telephone systems are now required to comply with federal E911 regulations. Today's program will look at what compliance entails and how you can keep your people safe and your organization protected. To lead this event, we're pleased to welcome Matt Schmid, a senior manager at Everbridge. His career spans several industries, including SaaS solutions. He previously served at Red Sky, which was acquired by Everbridge in 2021. Mr. Schmid's work now focuses on educating business leaders on protecting employees and proactively shielding organizations from the risk of non-compliance with FCC regulations for Universal 911. With introductions complete, I'm pleased now to turn over the webcast microphone to our speaker, Matt Schmid.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar today. As Mike said, I am Matt Schmid, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Everbridge. You might already know that federal E911 regulation compliance dates are amongst us. We will discuss those dates for sure, but let's also talk about what's behind these regulations and, most importantly, what it is exactly that your organization needs to do to be compliant with these laws. After all, compliance will mean protecting your people while keeping your businesses operational with reduced risk exposure. One last thing before we get started, though. It's my understanding, and as Mike was talking about a second ago, that some of you stand to gain credits for sitting in on this webinar. When we're done, the good news is you'll also be able to take action to mitigate risk at your business or organization and help protect its people. Okay, so today's organizations are being asked to do more with less. And part of that is keeping your employees safe, whether they're on premise or if they work at home. It's absolutely the new normal. That's not hyperbole. And we're all juggling priorities. This list here is no slouch of a priority list. So what actually are the priorities and how do we balance them? These will be some of the things I'll ask you to consider while we talk today. We'll get back to this in just a minute. A quick important note. We're providing information about compliance. So we do feel obligated to offer our disclaimer that we're not lawyers. And so please do consult your legal counsel before taking any action or even refraining from action regarding the information that we're presenting today. Cannot stress that enough. Please do check out your legal counsel. And a quick look at Everbridge and Red Sky, extending a bit on what Mike was saying in the intro. Red Sky joined the global Everbridge family in January of 2021, about a year ago. Red Sky is based in the Windy City in Chicago and has served the US and Canada going back 20 years as the longest stretch of any E911 business. Now, Everbridge is the global leader in critical event management and enterprise resilience software applications that automate and accelerate an organization's ability to respond to critical events in order to keep people safe and businesses running. And just another note before we get into all the compliance talk, as you do take note of the many dimensions of being compliant, know that the Red Sky solutions from Everbridge offer 100% E911 compliance. So today we'll start off with an overview of Kerry's Law and Ray Baum's Act. These are a couple of laws that are central to this discussion. We'll talk about protecting workers, the steps needed for compliance, important dates and deadlines, and spoiler alert, again, we're past them all. And we've got some parting gifts, some nice resources for you. And finally, we'll collect some Q&A as we go, and we'll go over some of that at the end. So why is it the time to act now? It kind of comes down to one concept. Last year, the FCC published a new set of rules around 911 for multiple line telephone systems. Okay, pause right there and ask, Matt, what are you getting us into? And what is a multi-line telephone system? Right, well, the next slide, I'll take you through a few terms. But for now, let's just presume most organizations have a multi-line telephone system. That's kind of the baseline that we're talking about here. Okay, getting back to these FCC rules. In those rules, the FCC placed several effective dates. In fact, between Kerry's Law and Ray Baum's Act, and more about these in a second, there were three important dates to recognize. At Everbridge, we've been talking about these dates for a long time. For you, we've just this month crossed the last date on none other than January 6th, 2022. And we know we can't just throw a switch and expect everything to work. It takes planning. And in terms of planning, we also know that in order to do anything and do it well, it takes money and it takes budget. And it takes a budget cycle. So we want to help you at least understand what you're going to need to do and the time it takes to prepare to get ready to go. So some key terms we need to be aware of. PSAP, Public Safety Answering Point. This is the physical building where 911 calls are answered. In the United States, there's about 6,000 of them. Some are tiny, very small. Some that employ over 1,000 people and are in massive metropolitan areas like New York and such, that take millions of calls a year. Hard phones or a static device. This is really key because the FCC rules focus in on this concept. And this hard phone is most often a phone like you see in the lower right-hand corner, but can take really any stationary device that are enabled to make calls. And then soft phones. These are typically found on laptops that enable them to make what we all feel are the normal dial tone type calls. And if these devices, whether on a laptop or a tablet or even a smartphone, because we do Zoom and WebEx and all sorts of things like that on our phones, if they're drawing enterprise dial tone, meaning they're supplied by your company, then they fall into these regulations. But wait, what about that phone system you talked about? the MLTS, pretty much every organization that has more than, let's say, 20 people in it has an MLTS for phones. And then there's one more. I think you might be asking yourself, we're talking about 911. The E in E911 stands for Enhanced 911. It's not electronic 911 or enterprise 911. Basically, this 911 call, the E911 call, comes with a lot more information than just the street address that you would typically get in a residential type of 911 call. So on August 1st, 2019, the FCC adopted what's called a report and order requiring E911 for enterprise spaces. The FCC adopted the rules to set minimum E911 legislation across the US. Yes, there already were laws in place, but at the state level only, and they were all over the place, and not every state had them. All enterprises using multi-line telephone systems, or the MLTS, are subject to this FCC report and order. So by definition, this includes nearly every organization and business in the United States. So getting into Kerry's Law that I mentioned earlier. Kerry's Law came out of a tragic event. A Texas woman named Carrie Hunt was assaulted in a hotel room. At that time, her 9-year-old child tried to call 911, but she did not know that she needed to dial 9 to get an outside line. Most unfortunately, Carrie Hunt died that day, and the hotel eventually had to pay a $41 million legal claim to the family of Carrie Hunt. So part 1 of Kerry's Law says you cannot require anybody to dial a prefix like 9 or 8 or anything that we're used to, and we've had for years, to get an outside line before reaching 911. Just calling 911 has to complete that emergency call and connect to that PSAP we were talking about, the emergency call center. There's a simple yardstick for determining whether your phones apply. We talk about it. If you can dial for a pizza from whatever device you're calling from, then you must be able to dial 911 without any problem as well. And by the way, that thing you see there is a deep pan pizza, and you can find them in Chicago. Just saying. So again, we won't get into the detail, but that detail mentions who is on the hook in this spectrum of stakeholders. And these include manufacturers of telecommunications systems and the software that runs them, distributors and resellers, installers, and even those organizations that manage and operate systems on behalf of companies like ours. This is not a trivial aspect of all of this, but if you believe your business falls into one of these buckets, you for sure want to make sure not only is your business compliant, like we've been talking about, but that your business is making other businesses compliant as well. Super important point. Lots and lots of detail behind that from a legal standpoint. You can find lots and lots of legal information on this. There's an incredible amount of detail to get into this, but the basics actually get you compliant. So that's all we're going to cover. In part 2 of Kerry's Law, it was felt that had the hotel been notified that somebody in a room had dialed 911, that person would have been able to not only assist, but to also help first responders find the caller. Thus, the emergency notifications component. And as I was saying, that the people that can be notified include a security desk attendant, a receptionist, or anyone across the organization who is felt could be useful to an emergency caller, or might be best situated to assist first responders in gaining access to the part of the facility where the caller is calling from. And you see dispatchable location there. And more on that in a moment. Okay, that was a lot of info. So the takeaways here are twofold. You can see how all of this protects your people, and the risk of liability is clear and quite significant. And so it's a balance, right? It's a balance of, are we protecting our people, which is, of course, job one, and are we actually protecting the business? Kerry's Law was the first E911 compliance law to take effect, and is thus the most widely known and referenced component of the FCC regulation. And you may have heard of Kerry's Law already too, well before you were getting notifications about this webinar. All right, so apologies in advance for the boredom here, but let's just quickly read the front end of this paragraph since it's relevant. All right. Kerry's Law expressly provides that Congress did not intend to alter the authority of state commissions or other state or local agencies, blah, blah, blah. Okay, what does this mean? This means that, hey, if the state has a tougher or more rigorous law, you need to weigh that first, or at least equally, as it's likely going to be the law you'll pay attention to, and the one that matters. Now, that's not a rule. The federal law, the one that we've been talking about, may very well be the one that's more rigorous, and that's the one that should apply. It is in fact stated in these rules and regulations that the more rigorous rule rules the day. So pay attention to your state. There's information on the web about state compliance rules. Some of them go back quite a ways. It doesn't mean that they're out of date or anything, because they've been around for a while. Some states were a bit more further advanced on E911 rules. And the whole idea of this federal law, though, was to really pull this all together, right? To make sure that everyone was protected equally. Okay, so next up is Section 506, a small but very important portion of the Ray Bombs Act. And Ray Baum is an actual person. It's actually also an acronym, and that's why you'll typically see it in all caps. It's an acronym that stands for something relevant to the rest of the law. It's not so much of an E911 thing. There's a small slice, Section 506 of it, that is relevant to E911, and that's what we're talking about here. The law says that for every 911 call, there has to be a dispatchable location that is sent with that call to the dispatch center. And dispatchable location is the street address and other information such as floor or zone or room number. So it's important to note that the FCC went out of its way not to quantify dispatchable location as it's intent-based. So let's kind of review, right? It's such as floor, zone, room number. These things are going to be different in every situation. And we'll talk about that. But for example, they didn't say you need a dispatchable location for 10,000 square feet or every 5,800 square feet. So more on that in just a second. Also, I will speak about the different devices that fall into these regulations, as well as the compliance dates associated with them. But as you can see here, all compliance dates for the full weight of this FCC regulation have now passed, with the last one passing just days ago. So in summary, the definition of dispatchable location is that we adopt today gives participants in the MLTS marketplace flexibility in deciding what level of detail should be included in the location information provided to PSAPs for particular environments, so long as the level of detail is functionally sufficient to enable first responders to identify the location of the 911 caller in that environment. So that is a mouthful, lots of stuff to look at. This matrix is pretty simple and straightforward. There's some repetition of dates here, but you'll see why it's relevant. The dates are important even though we're now past them all and do relate exclusively to Ray-Bombs Act compliance. Across the top, you have hard phones, the ones you've got on your desk, and soft phones. Along the left side, you have on and off premise detail. And in the middle, you have all the dates for those. So now let's take a look, or some time, I should say, to repeat this. All the dates have now passed. So if you knew about Ray-Bombs Act a year ago, you'd think you had some time until the next one hit. Well, we're all in the same boat now, and this law does not discriminate. All organizations in the U.S. that operate in MLTS, and that's pretty much every one of us, we're all in on these deadlines. They're all in the past. So let's take our foot off the gas here for a second and reflect why these laws came to be. It's again pretty simple. Connect first responders with the information they need to successfully assist in an emergency. Get to the 911 caller as swiftly as possible. And finally, to be technologically agnostic. 911 callers need to get emergency services, and technology just cannot get in the way of this. So I think it should be clear who the beneficiaries are of this legislation. First and foremost, it's the 911 caller in the midst of an emergency, of course. Finding a person on the east side of the 16th floor of the building that's locked down is a challenge just by itself, not to mention if first responders do not have the location information they need from the very beginning. And of course, companies themselves stand to gain from this legislation and acting on it, getting compliant with it. Protecting employees is job one, but let's be clear about the risks to a business of not being compliant. They are high and they're costly. I'll spare you from reading this. You're going to get a copy, a PDF of this deck. You can go through the detail when you get it. But this comes up. Are you associated with small business? Are you a nonprofit even? Your organization is not exempt. The objective threshold has to do with the fact that there's an MLTS in place and people using that MLTS. And that can be problematic, as we've talked about. The law is in place to eliminate the barriers to safe outcome when a 911 call is placed. Hopefully that's kind of coming through loud and clear in this presentation. It is central to everything. Okay, let's sum up for a second before we get to the next segment. The triggers to meet the requirements include the deadline dates themselves and when major updating of an existing system takes place. We have the direct dialing and notifications component of Carey's Law. And the teeth come from the Enforcement Bureau of the FCC. The manufacturer, supplier, and the end user must comply and share in the liability. And again, the detail behind that small sentence is extensive. It's very extensive, but again, we're talking about making companies compliant and people safe, and we're not talking about being a supplier and being a manufacturer. However, if you are one of these, take note. There's so much detail to get into around dispatchable location. Like I said, we'll talk more about that, and we'll have resources for you to investigate further. So we now understand the why for all this. Now let's pivot to the action plan. What does it take to prepare? What does it take to plan, which is different, right? And then what does it take to protect your employees, guests, and even the visitors to your business? So how do you prepare? Really preparing means understanding this concept, and I'm going to say it again, this concept of dispatchable locations. And this isn't the end of it. We're going to be talking more about this. This understanding includes where your so-called, quote, endpoints are, whether this is a device in the building or if we're talking about a remote worker making a call from a laptop. And then understanding what kind of technologies may come with your phone system and what you may need to do to supplement these systems. Okay, hold up. I want to, again, reassure you that this discussion is not about telecommunications technology. I'm not going to drag you through manifestations of voice over IP versus analog systems and PBX versus SIP trunking as much as I'd like to. However, this is about compliance, risk management, and protecting your people. And to actually do these things, we will need to partner with our friends in IT and telecommunications. So back to Carey's Law. And here is where compliance meets collaboration. As I was saying, if getting started on this journey for your organization will fall into your lap, your first move may be to connect with your tech partners to ensure they have a good understanding of your call servers, which is essentially your phone system. So it's always good to make friends with everyone in IT. I think we all understand that, right? So This is just another reason why you should make good friends with them, because you never know when you're going to need to call on them to be partners with you and collaborating on a project. So you do need to understand who are the people that should be notified too. So let's talk about that notification, right? Remember that? Who are those people who need to be notified if ever a 911 call is placed? For example, a college campus may have a safety department that has a dedicated person to notify. But a sprawling automobile dealership may not have such a person. Is there a reception desk, a security team? Who is that person or team in your organization? You really never know who that's going to be. Dimensions for companies, they expand and contract. And, who that person who's got that domain knowledge of, the full campus or the building that you're in, that's the person you want to collaborate with, and who should be accepting those notifications. So Ray Baum's Act. Remember, this is really centered on this concept of, wait for it, dispatchable locations, right? So whether it's a map or, a table or a handwritten list or a spreadsheet, it will be important to make sure that every building in your enterprise has a legitimate street address. And sometimes you'd be surprised about that. Again, this will take close coordination with teams across your organization, and clearly the facilities people are going to be in your short list. And just a quick side note, since you are good enough to sit in on this session today, you will receive the Fast Track to E911 Compliance Handbook from Everbridge. In this handbook, you'll find details of all the teams who will need to be involved and what they need to do. And I'll show you a little bit more detail on what's inside that book too. Okay, there's lots of E911 solutions out there. Some are built into those call servers I mentioned. Discover what you're providing or your provider is providing natively to determine if that meets your needs. And as a rule of thumb, an organization with over 200 hard phones will likely need a programmatic approach. So you don't need a programmatic approach to be E911 compliant. But when you do scale up at a certain number, you will likely need a programmatic approach, meaning you're going to need some budget for some technology. And you're likely using soft phone clients now on the laptops that you do use. Well, that just kind of breaks 911 right there. Why? Because we can take laptops anywhere. You can take them across to a conference room. You can take them to another office when you're in the office. And of course, you can take them to wherever you're going. So do your research. So plan. Okay, you kind of know what you have to do. Now, how do you do it? There's really a couple things you want to balance. Your work plan, budget cycles, contract stuff, mapping buildings and devices, et cetera, deployment, lots of stuff. Your typical project. Remember the teamwork and collaboration bits I mentioned before? It's really going to take a team to pull this off. All right, Carey's Law, right. The due date has passed long ago. The asterisk is there due to some exceptions around updates versus new equipment. And I mentioned hinted at this a little bit before. But given the last 12 to 18 months, you got to think lots and lots of updates have likely occurred and updates to those updates. It all got fast forwarded about 10 years, I think. And if any system upgrades are planned, you need to make sure that you're planning to become compliant as a part of that effort. So another way to look at that is you might think, oh, we're not doing wholesale changes. We're grandfathered in, and there are some grandfathering rules. But really, if you're upgrading anything, and again, looking back in the rearview mirror, the last 2 years, if you haven't upgraded your telecommunications abilities, then you're probably way behind on other things as well. So back to dispatchable location. I'm just going to tell you, and this is why we have the disclaimer that we're not lawyers. It's a pretty soft topic. The FCC and most states just don't define what dispatchable location means. So let's look at some big pictures here for some help. To the pictures. So in the picture up here in the upper right-hand corner, you've got this 50,000 square foot loading dock. It's got a nice open line of sight, a couple of doors. You can see all of the phones on all of the walls. If a first responder comes in and either one of those doors that you see here, they're very likely going to see who needs help. And if I go down to the warehouse, I've got all these racks of equipment and I can't see across the room. I'm going to need to create multiple zones to help guide the first responder to find out where that caller is coming from. And closed door offices, to me, this is a no-brainer. Everyone that needs a closed door office needs their own dispatchable location. In this picture, how are you supposed to know? How's anyone supposed to know, much less someone who's never been on this floor, which office the caller is coming from without having it programmed in this dispatchable location that we've been talking about? So hopefully you're getting this understanding, this very clear understanding that dispatchable location is kind of like this, extra information that clearly shows, where the person in distress is. And there's rules around how that can be created. And not so much rules, but hints how to make a good dispatchable location. And then finally, you've got this big open cube farm. Since it's likely only 2 doors coming in, the location of who needs help should be evident. You can almost kind of visualize that yourself. You could get by with just a single dispatchable location. But just a footnote, if there's 500 people in there, you want to be smart about that, right? And you want to break it into zones. But in this picture, one should do. So the last part of the plan is to find your E911 solution. We know that these dates are not just upon us, they're in the past. And this project is complex. Everbridge and RedSky will get you to 100% compliance. So finally, protect. So why are you doing this? It's not just because it's the right thing to do. You want to make sure that you're protecting the most important aspects of your operating environment. And that's employee and guest safety, right? Anybody could pick up a phone and just dial 911. Be sure both your people and your business are protected. So the responsibility of the employer is now documented, which means while before these laws were in place, somebody could decide, nobody ever dials 911. Well, When something bad happens, now somebody can point to this and say, hey, you weren't compliant. This is now where you can plainly see that the corporate risk portfolio just grew significantly. And remember, those dates, they're behind us. You know, the common vision of the world is that people are going to be working remotely indefinitely. And there's some recent, very recent today, in fact, challenges to that. Big companies announcing getting back to work. But you need to make sure that your employees who are using corporate assets, and even at home or on the road or even on vacation, admit it, we do it. We need to make sure all of them are protected when this emergency inevitably occurs. And this last one, and I kind of struggled with the wording of it. The idea of deploying a 911 solution is not only to protect your employees, but it's also to mitigate the risk associated with something bad happening. So it's there to protect the employer as well, too. Again, back to that risk portfolio. So this is the commercial part of it. The Red Sky solutions from Everbridge, and again, just remember this: find, route, and notify. Everbridge provides you the tools so that you're compliant. We have the solutions to find employees making 911 calls no matter where they are. Everbridge provides the routing to all these PSAPs we talked about. And this is across the US and Canada. Of course, the rules that we were just talking about are US specific. There's 5 flavors of notifications supporting remote workers, and you can almost guess that they're text messages and screen pops and emails, all different kinds. And then the Everbridge footprint covers the US and Canada today and will more likely to follow. The key is the tools are there for you to be compliant. So please help yourself to these free resources. I believe they will also be provided to you as a participant of this webinar event. Some links for you at any rate. The fast track to E911 compliance handbook and the E911 Made Easy project checklist. You can, again, use these easy links below, send them to other people, send your files to other people that you get for this webinar. Be our guest, of course. But in the fast track handbook, you're going to find that's broken into 2 easy parts. One is understanding the E911 regulations. And we went through a lot of detail, but the handbook's got even more. It's stuff we just went through on the FCC. The Carey's Law, direct dialing, notifications, Ray Bombs Act, dispatchable location, and the detail that you need to share. And then the second part are 3 basic steps to get you to compliance. One is define your enterprise. So this is going to be where you're going to have lots of people you'll be working with to understand what your enterprise looks like from a device standpoint. You're going to want to identify all the stakeholders involved. And the last step would be, of course, budget and procurement. How do you go about that? What do you need to consider? And then lastly, there's even more resources to look at. So thank you. We're now going to look at some of the questions that came up. I'm going to kind of hand that over back to Mike, and we'll get through some of this Q&A.
Thank you. We will turn to audience questions in just a moment. This program is sponsored by Everbridge. Everbridge is a global leader for integrated critical event management solutions that automate and accelerate organizations' operational response to critical events to help keep people safe and businesses running faster. Over 3,700 global organizations rely on the Everbridge Critical Event Management Platform to deliver resilience on an unprecedented scale. Red Sky was acquired by Everbridge in January 2021 and has been providing E911 solutions for more than 20 years. To learn more, visit everbridge.com. All right, let's turn to your questions. We'll start with this one from an audience member who asks, so what happens when I call 911 using my mobile phone?
Right. It's probably the most common question, and that's probably why it popped up first. And it's pretty simple. Mobile phones and their service providers operate separately from all that was discussed here, right? Calls made using dial tone from wireless providers are tracked using different technology. However, some soft phone clients, as I was saying on this call, they do operate on smartphones, and thus they're impacted. So just kind of the recap there, I think there's a number, something like 80 to 85% of 911 calls are made on smartphones, and that's not going to be news to anyone. I think everyone can intuitively understand that and appreciate that. But that 15% that's made from these other types of devices, and when we're at work, we're talking about those devices that are on this MLTS. Sometimes they're going to be on smartphones. Like I said, the Zoom call, WebEx, other different providers, they've got these dial tone components to them where you can literally dial 911. And so when you're doing that and using your smartphone for that, that's when the smartphone and the mobile phone is impacted. But by and large, they are kind of a separate thing.
Continuing with audience questions, a couple of viewers have asked, what is the difference between 911 and E911?
Right. Touched on a little bit on that on the call, on this presentation, but it's this difference between 911 and E911, again, or enhanced 911, is that basic 911 only connects the call to the PSAP, this public safety answering point, or the emergency response center, but does not carry with it any other details, right? Such as the address, the floor number. So basic 911 is used in very few areas today. There is and are components that of E911 that counties and states and these locales that operate in their taxing bodies, these 911 PSAPs, that are actually carrying more information than just the address.
All right, continuing with our audience questions, viewer asks, my company gave me a sticker that says don't dial 911 from this device. Is this compliant with the FCC regulations?
100% no, it is not. That's interesting. You don't hear much of that anymore, but we see a little bit of that still. This question. You can kind of consider that a hack. A hack to get around state regulations. If you recall those state regulations that I was talking about, they had little loopholes in them that were found, of course, and exploited. That these stickers, they said, look, if you're going to make a 911 call, use your cell phone. Do not use this device. They were literally put on phones. Hopefully that's not the case where you work. The federal laws that are in place do address this.
All right, another viewer asks, can I opt out of E911?
You cannot opt out if you're your business or organization is headquartered and operates within the USA or Canada. So the answer is no. You cannot opt out of this. You cannot opt out of compliance within the U.S. to the extent of the legislation that we were just reviewing. So more or less, the answer is no. That said, I will reflect back on that legal, disclaimer that we provided earlier, which basically says, hey, look, if you've got something that looks, feels like, and acts like a legal question, then make sure you go to your counsel, to your attorneys on hand, and ask those questions.
Continuing with our viewer questions, do I need to cover remote workers?
Yes, starting on January 6th, 2022, right, which is now in the past, you must cover remote workers with enhanced or E911 or E911 solution. So again, this is that date that we're talking about, these two January 6th bookends, 2021 and 2022. 2021 talked about coverage for these hard phones. Remote workers, of course, by definition, are not going to have these static devices, these black phones that we all have on our desks at work, in the office, or at the shop, or wherever we find ourselves working. But remote workers were covered by the second part of Ray Baum's Act that we just passed on January 6, 2022. So this includes any worker with a remote soft phone on their laptop, and again, who taps into that enterprise multi-line telephone system.
All right, we'll continue with our questions. What happens if we conducted system upgrades after February 16th, 2020, but we didn't do full replacements?
Right. So the date, going back to that February 16th, 2020, so just lots of dates were thrown at you. Important to note, all in the past. But this February 16th of 2020 was the Kerry's Law date. And it did have a component in it that talked about system upgrades and so on. You will need to comply with Kerry's Law and Ray Baum's Act, even if it was not a full replacement. Again, the legal disclaimer. But as a rule of thumb, any upgrade that you do, even if it's not a full replacement, is going to be under this compliance regulation. So again, consult your attorneys on this, but expect to hear what I was just saying.
All right, we'll continue with our audience questions. We've got a viewer who asks this: how does implementing an E911 solution make me compliant with Ray Baum's Act or Kerry's Law?
When implementing an E911 solution, there are those three features it must have that we talked about to be compliant with both laws. It must provide an on-site notification alert that is triggered as soon as the individual dials 911, right? So that on-site notification we talked about. When a 911 call is made from an on-campus phone, and I use that, the business campus, right, or any organization's campus, and the call's answered by the PSAP, the location information automatically presented to the 911 operator must include accurate information. Okay, so then the final piece of this, I guess, is when a 911 call is made from a device not located within a corporate facility, the caller's current correct address must be automatically presented to that PSAP. So this includes situations where the caller is working remotely from home, a coffee shop, a hotel, or any of these other locations that they can connect from and really place a call from.
And we'll close with this question: what is NG911 and is it required?
NG911 is a new. Well, shouldn't say new. It's actually been around for a while. NG911 stands for Next Generation 911. As technologies have advanced, these PSAP operators are now requesting, again, not the small ones, but these big ones, the large ones. They're now requesting to receive additional 911 call location information, like a floor map or even links to cameras. So think of it as like this rich information that's coming through the bandwidth that we've now have available to us. It's been under consideration. It's been developed. Standards are being created for years. And while this technology allows for a tremendous amount of extra data to be presented to PSAP operators, it's not yet required by law. And you can almost imagine that it's not just the data itself. The PSAP operators actually have to have the equipment to look at a camera, to connect to a camera, to look at something that's going on, to view a map, and to be able to navigate a map. So there's a lot of dimension to that, but that's essentially the reason why we don't have this advancement yet today. But you can really bank on that being something that we will have sometime in the close future.
Thank you. We are coming to the end of this program. Before we sign off, we want to thank Matt Schmid from Everbridge for the insight he shared today. And we want to thank everyone tuning in for being with us and for choosing SHRM for HR webcasts. That concludes this program.